Hello, and welcome to an episode of something I haven't done for quite a long time. The series, well, pseudo-series, once called Rants and Raves. I am the social solipsist, and as I said, I haven't done one of these in a long time, and technically I don't know if this one even qualifies anymore, because I literally started writing notes about this in June, maybe May? I didn't check the date that I originally opened this. The other videos in this series were mostly right off the cuff, but this one I felt deserved a little bit more attention, and unfortunately that got out of hand because I'm a crazy person. So yeah, that is all to say that this video was just supposed to have a little bit extra, and through a combination of procrastination and attempts at perfectionism, I have once again sabotaged myself for months and months. And if I didn't start doing this video now, it was never going to happen. So, without further ado, this is my video on what I have titled this document, I guess, Misused RPG Mechanical Complexity in Darkest Dungeon, The Banner Saga, and The Witcher 2. So, for those of you who, of course, I'm getting notifications now, excuse me. For those of you who watched my Banner Saga playthrough, you'll have some better idea of the time that I was thinking about this. It was some time ago. I'm also going to tack on one more game to that list, which is Grim Dawn, which is the reason why it has come back into my sort of view recently. Although this tab with this document has literally been open since I started writing it like 6 months ago. Anyway, so all of these games have some similarities, at least in what I want to talk about. That is not to say that they all should be compared to each other, or that they are all of similar quality, or anything of the sort. And regardless of what I say about issues with them, nobody should take that as a judgment on my personal judgment on the game as a whole, nor should anybody take it personally if it sounds like I'm saying something about a game that you disagree with. That is totally fine. This is completely subjective. Anyway, with that out of the way, I have some problems with RPGs and games that use RPG mechanics. Back in the day, says the old man, RPG systems, classic RPGs had lots of mechanics to make up for their shortcomings. Character progression, job systems, party composition, character builds, lots of things that were in no small part built to lengthen the game and encourage replayability. And some of those things are no longer, well, if you replay them now, they feel antiquated. And one of those reasons is a lot of these things were meant to fill in gaps for things they either couldn't do because of budget or because of technology, or just the nature of the games industry at the time. The amount of money in the games industry now is so much, unbelievably more than it was 10 years ago even, let alone 20 or 30 years ago, that comparing them is just impossible. So as a result, we have a lot of modern games that have old problems. And unfortunately, a lot of the developers of the old games are not the ones making the new ones and haven't learned their lessons. So this is about some issues I have with all these games with regards to that. And basically, my thoughts were synthesized down to, this is very much about complexity versus depth, which are not the same thing at all. They are related to one another, but not even that closely related. And that's what I'm going to sort of pick at in general. That's the whole thing I want you to have in the back of your mind while I discuss the rest of this, is that complexity is not depth. Depth, in general, is good. It means that you are immersed in the narrative, you're immersed in the character, there is a richness to the world and to the mechanics that keeps you interested, and that applies both to the gameplay effects, or the gameplay itself, and the narrative that they are telling. Complexity, on the other hand, is neither good nor bad. It is simply let's consider it a metric for basically how hard a game is to understand. So in the best scenarios, you add a little bit of complexity to the game, and you add a lot of depth as a result. It doesn't take, as those of you who have played a variety of games know, it doesn't take a huge twist in a gameplay structure to have a dramatic effect on how the game feels. So in general, what I have been seeing and has frustrated me a little bit is an over complexifying of games, or at the same time a belief that somehow simply adding complexity also adds depth. There are scenarios, and they're not that infrequent either, where adding complexity adds no depth and in fact detracts from the depth because it just distracts from the game itself. So it also has to do, complexity has to do with game balance and game difficulty. But it seems like quite often devs end up shooting themselves, inexperienced devs, I'm just going to use that as a blanket term, shoot themselves in the foot, just adding extra complexity with this wrongly held belief that it adds depth to the game. And often it doesn't. Adding extra variables does not make for a more compelling gameplay or more compelling narrative. So let me jump into the games specifically, because I've been thinking about all of these. What initially actually made me think about this as this sort of like 3 games, Darkest Dungeon, Banner Saga, and The Witcher 2, is if I've edited this right, if I haven't lost the footage in the meantime, this was prompted by me playing the Darkest Dungeon over a free weekend, which I still don't own it and I didn't buy it, but all it took was that free weekend for me to go, this is not for me. And also just sort of like I played for a couple of hours and sort of picked apart what bothered me about it and what was not compelling to me. So let's start with that one, I guess. Darkest Dungeon makes its linchpin money and pseudo money, so items that you have to collect certain numbers of to hit certain unlocks. This is an RPG progression system of sorts. This is a multi-layered RPG progression system because you have progression of individual characters, both for better or for worse, but also unlocking stuff in the town that you're in. So fundamentally, the game can be cheesed pretty handily, and a lot of the gameplay loop can be eliminated simply by removing the barrier of the money. And as I have spoken about before, and I'm trying to think if any of the games I've recorded I've actually actively done this, there are games, largely RPGs, where I will just cheat myself in money because it reduces the amount of what I view as needless repetition, the grind, the parts that may be fun or may not be fun. Listen, I'm not above a good grindy game. I play a few of them very intentionally and quite a lot. But if the core gameplay loop is not incredibly compelling, forcing me to do it over and over again for hours and hours and be seemingly punished as part of that to like basically, you know, keep this sort of Stockholm syndrome going for me to keep coming back to it. That's not something I wanna play. If you're gonna make me grind, I want to have fun during the grind. And Darkest Dungeon is a game where I was not really having fun during the grind. It's possibly the most overt in that sense because it literally punishes you for playing the game. You essentially want to be as efficient as possible and take as few trips as possible and, you know, skirt the edge of disaster as much as possible while still, you know, staying on the side of, you know, in the black and not in the red. So that you don't, because if you, you know, if you don't do enough or if you do too much, the game punishes you, like actively punishes you. And I do not find a lot of fun in that. But to each their own. Again, like I said at the beginning, this is not a judgment. This is not a judgment, and this is completely subjective. So, what I did during my the free weekend where I played for a couple of hours was I just cheated in all of the upgrades, or the money for all the upgrades for all of the stores and all the things, and suddenly it wasn't quite so miserable. And boy, if your game is actively miserable to you until you know, learn how to deal with its abuse, that doesn't strike me as particularly compelling. So, yeah. I guess we'll jump from that one straight to Grim Dawn, which is the one I've been thinking about most recently. I've been playing it with my friend Spencer, and collectively we've had some concerns about it. That's not to say that we're not having a good time, but the game absolutely has some problems. Grim Dawn is possibly the most classic of the games listed here in terms of comparison to older, direct comparisons to older RPGs. It's very much in the Diablo-like vein. And it uses a multifaceted RPG system that frankly just has way too many variables and not nearly enough tools to let you figure out whether you're actually succeeding at what you want to do. Now, fundamentally speaking, these like the hack and slash type of games are not necessarily about, you know, having your optimal build. The core thing is, you know, if you're continuing to make progress in the game, if you're not, you know, being destroyed by the enemies you're coming up against, you're probably all right. Once you start to struggle is where you start to, you know, look for upgrades if you're not already getting them progressively. The problem is that Grim Dawn turns it all up to 11 compared to Diablo 1, 2, and 3, and a number of other competitors. With the except, I haven't played Path of Exile because I fear Path of Exile. Path of Exile may be the even worse version of this. Grim Dawn has too many classes. It has classes, skills, tons of equipment, tons of drops for equipment, and just so many different directions to go. And each one of those contribute to an enormous list of statistics that, while not fundamentally a problem, are very hard to track down what aspects of your choices and your equipment and your skills and all these other things are contributing in what way to your performance in the game. And so there's sort of this fundamental disconnect between the numbers you're reading and what you're actually seeing on the screen. And the only translation, the only direct visible translation in many cases is how successful you are being and how close to death you're coming when you are fighting things. And they're just simply are not like, we've both been bemoaning the lack of, even in the tooltips, being able to see like what is the source of this type of damage, which of my equipment has been contributing in what way, like what's the math behind behind this stat. And I won't speak on Spencer's behalf, but in my case, it's don't I don't dislike having, you know, lots of stats to min max. In fact, I'm kind of a sucker for that kind of thing. But I need the tools at my disposal to see whether my min maxing is working. And in Grim Dawn, more often than not, I feel like I am not getting those tools. Those tools don't exist, and I'm not able to make good decisions. So I'm just constantly going, what is this? What is that? Like, even knowing whether, hey, what's the name of that? Is that one of my skills? I don't even know. So that's sort of the Grim Dawn issue in a nutshell. Now let's leap backwards to the Banner Saga, which has, as I mentioned during the playthrough to some extent, and now that I'm far enough away from it and sort of never wanted to think about it again, my memory is going to be a little bit hazier. But going off my notes and my memory, Banner Saga really has a threefold progression problem, where you can only level, and it's sort of the like opposite funnel, the opposite shape problem. If this will make more sense once I explain it. It's the opposite shape problem that Grim Dawn has. Grim Dawn has a ton of stuff that filters down to basically one thing or a small set of things. The Banner Saga has the opposite problem, where you can only level up with points, which you can only get from killing enemies. But you also, at the same time, you have to, and the only way you can kill enemies is by doing battles, which have a potential to cause semi-permanent or permanent harm to your party. And at the same time, you still have to have a certain number of kills with any given character to have that progression be possible in the first place. So you can theoretically have, if you, especially if, like me, you try and level people up relatively evenly, you can have the whole party's progression be hampered dramatically by trying to spread out the kills, where instead of having a team of level 4s, you have 3 teams worth of level 2s. Or you can go the opposite way and have a team of level 5s and everybody else, or almost everyone else, is level 1. Because there's also this gameplay issue where there's not the tactic. I've talked about it in the game. I won't delve into it too much here, but the tactics system is not good enough for there to be a fundamentally good or bad loadout of characters for almost any given battle. So it's just, I don't know, who's not dead. So you've got all these conflicting structures that funnel down to the one thing of, can you level up or not? And that linchpin is so on such a thin thread. It's just, now I'm getting caught up in my mind with Banner Saga, and it's making me frustrated. Banner Saga is bad. It has no RPG progression system. It just has the facsimile of one, and it's a very poor facsimile. However, and I am aware that this is at some level sacrilege, especially for me, to compare Banner Saga to The Witcher 2, but I kind of have to. Which The Witcher 2 has this other sort of issue where it has a needlessly complex and expansive leveling tree and an XP system that rewards you very minimally for playing the game, in the sense of exploring and doing most things, that if you do anything other than the main story, you're basically making no quote unquote progress. You're not leveling up Geralt and his abilities, or it is extremely slow going to the point where it is almost pointless to do anything other than the main story if you don't care, if for some strange reason you don't care about the narrative. If all you care about is getting Geralt as powerful as possible, as quick as possible, you just beeline the main story, because the rest of it on a core gameplay, like gameplay and gameplay proficiency level, basically doesn't matter. And it's this expansive leveling tree is just completely out of place for a number of reasons, not the least of which is, especially in the early game, you can really make some like a couple of choices that aren't the quote unquote right ones, and suddenly for the next couple of hours you're really going to struggle, basically until you finish the next main story mission. You won't have the points to level up and make up for your the skills you're lacking. So this is sort of the point where I'm going to make the flip and talk about less directly the mechanical problems and more about what the side effects it has on narrative and story and the things that are not directly driven by the gameplay, but are deeply entangled with them in a good game, right? So I'm going to continue that in talking about The Witcher 2. Because my fundamental problem with The Witcher 2, and it is a game I quite like, my fundamental problem with it is that The Witcher 2 seems to be trying to tell a very specific story, but it is hampered by the RPG systems. At least in my mind, Geralt is Geralt. There are not diverging timelines of Geralt. I've never liked that. In The Witcher, when I played The Witcher 1, I went true neutral Geralt, which apparently is not, I don't think is even the canon choice. I didn't make some of the canon choices, but I made the choices that seemed canon to me in terms of what I believed Geralt as a Witcher would have done. And whether or not, any given path in the story is true or not, it has always struck me as odd that there are diverging paths at all in The Witcher 2. This seems to be an artifact of more modern storytelling, more modern game storytelling, and more modern writing especially in RPGs, where there seems to be this misconception that giving the player choice is the most important thing. Now, I'm not going to delve into the issues of choice and pseudo choice in this game, or in this game or any game, or games in general. There have been a great many treatises written and yelled and spoken about such things, in some minor ways even by myself in previous videos. But specifically in the context of The Witcher 2, or the Witcher series in general, it strikes me that there should only be one narrative. Geralt is Geralt. He only does the things that Geralt would do. And the idea of having a Witcher who has a completely different set of abilities or a completely different set of equipment or a different set of moral choices, to me seems completely at odds with the narrative. And this extends to the structure that I was just talking about of the leveling tree, where you do not have, even if you do every single thing in the game, you cannot fill out the tree. You can't even fill out the tree halfway. And calling it a tree is a misnomer of its own, because it doesn't branch like a tree. It literally goes in separate directions. So the idea that there is one narrative where Geralt is a great swordsman, and a completely separate narrative where Geralt is a decent swordsman but is an incredible alchemist, who relies on, you know, potions and things to do most of his work. And yet another where he's pretty crap at both those things, but he's an amazing mage. It seems completely at odds with the idea of having Geralt as a character. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a place for those sorts of choices. There are plenty of games over a great amount of gaming history where the idea of a blank slate character is sort of fundamental to the game, and sometimes it works well and sometimes it doesn't. I would probably argue that generally speaking, it makes for at least to my eye, makes for a less compelling, less interesting story, because not being able to not the writer not being able to make decisions for you, the less decisions the writer can make, or the less assumptions the writer can make about how your character will behave, the less specific they can be in the narrative they write around your character. If they know exactly how the story is going to go, aside from, you know, how hard you struggled on any given battle, that often makes for a much more compelling narrative because they know exactly how it went. And that's the other thing about The Witcher 2 is they sort of struggle in the gray area between those two things, where Geralt can be, you know, one of these three ways or some mix of the three, but they basically don't change his behaviors in most of the game, in the cutscenes, in his interactions with people, aside from some narrative choices, which, again, not going to get into here. Most of your mechanical choices have little to no effect on the story. And I hesitate to pull it out, but of course the looming term of ludonarrative dissonance comes into play here, where we're talking about a Geralt who does one thing in the gameplay and acts somewhat or completely different way in the cutscenes. So there's always a struggle there, and I'm not saying that it's easy to perfect either, but that one grated on me in a game that is otherwise fundamentally extremely good. So I spent a lot of time on The Witcher 2, but let me talk about the others as well, because it's less relevant to them, but still relevant. The Banner Saga. Let's not talk about the narrative because I've already done that in relation to the game directly. But I think what's relevant here is that it can't decide whether to be a graphic novel or a caravan management sim or a tactics game. And it does all three of those things rather poorly, rather to extremely poorly. And it tangles all of them up together in a way that they don't fit. It's not like a tightly woven for any game, really. The mechanics have to be tied in with the story that's being told, or the different aspects of a game. I think that's what a lot of people forget, is that games fundamentally are a mix of various media. You know, the interactive element is only one part of it. But the Banner Saga does such a poor job of all of its things, and then it ties them all together and it gets even worse. It is less than the sum of its parts, and its parts are already bad, is basically what I'm getting at here. And so its failure to commit to any of its mechanical needs the failure to build a solid mechanical basis is just sort of the crumbling mace, or the crumbling mortar between the like misshapen bricks that are the foundation of the game itself, and then everything else sits teetering on top, melting in the sun. It's a really tortured it's a really tortured metaphor, but I hope it makes sense. So Banner Saga is just a disaster of misused RPG stuff. Grim Dawn, like I said, is probably the most honest in what it's delivering, because it fundamentally doesn't try and get too far away from its predecessors or its competitors. For the longest time, it was really Diablo and only Diablo that did a certain type of, action RPG hack and slash game, at least in the strictest sense. There were lots of things that sort of were in a gray area around it. But for a long time, it didn't really have a lot of direct competition. Now it's become a much more well-recognized and well-mimicked. Mimicked and well-mimicked set of mechanics. And Grim Dawn fundamentally doesn't stray too far away, but it turns everything up to not 11, but like 17. But forgot to like adjust the gain so that when they turned it up that loud, it didn't just, rip through the speakers with feedback. Talking about tortured metaphors. It fails to see some of the nuance that made some of its predecessors fun, or the reasons why its predecessors did certain things certain ways. Diablo and Diablo 2 are quite old games at this point. And a lot of the reason they are the way they are comes down to clever reuse of assets to extend the length of the game while still keeping a compelling core gameplay loop that was not too punishing and not overly complex. The slow RPG leveling up fed directly into a well-metered sense of progression. Meanwhile, Grim Dawn has just an inordinate amount of enemies, an inordinate amount of items that drop that you have to filter through. Even with the loot filter system, which is a very welcome addition, it's not nearly enough to deal with the sheer flood of equipment that you get. And rarities are not directly tied to the inherent quality of any given loot for you or in general. In Diablo, if you got items of a certain rarity, you could more often not be almost completely assured that they would outclass what you already had. Grim Dawn is not the case. It is much more adhering to more modern ideas of I don't want to say quantity over quality, because there's lots of good gear, but then to, loop back to what I was talking about at the beginning, it's got so many stats and they're hard to track. So you're just staring at stats, like dozens and dozens and dozens of stats, trying to compare them. And you either spend hours doing it, and my apologies to Spencer, who seems to be more willing than me to just be like, yeah, fuck it, let's move on. My sensibilities from my earlier days of gaming have programmed me to meticulously look over stats to ensure that my min-maxing is right. And Grim Dawn exploits that to a point where I sit for 10 minutes at a time just filtering through what's fundamentally trash, but I can't seem to tell. Meanwhile, that extends, of course, to all the other mechanical stuff that I was referring to before. And at the same time, Grim Dawn, having turned everything up to 17, really manages to somehow fail to capitalize on the improvements of the time in terms of telling its narrative. Yes, there are certainly improvements. There's the welcome addition of some voice acting and more extensive dialogue written in general, and books of lore and things like that. But they are not implemented in a way that is frequent enough and compelling enough for that to be an appealing factor. Now, I fully understand that the people who play hack and slash action RPGs are usually not there for the story. But if you put a story in, it should be compelling. This is something I've said time and time again. If something is not important, remove it. Because if it isn't that important, but you include it and you put some work into it, but that work isn't enough, or if it's not commensurate with the quality of everything around it, well, quality is a bad choice of words in this particular example, but if it doesn't all, if not all the pieces seem to have been polished to the same extent, or given equal time to cure, it can be glaring. And that is sort of my feeling, where I bemoan the fact that I can't or won't or can't be bothered to spend the same time absorbing the narrative and story and a lot of these other things about Grim Dawn that are more related to its improvements in not indirect gameplay things, the story and narrative and characters. And I sort of wish just a little bit more care had been taken, because I don't think it would have taken that much more to get it to that next level. And in that same vein, to weave it all in with the RPG mechanics. I'm not saying that, there should be narrative choice, but there is something to be said for some fundamental class choices, then having effects on even just small things, the comments that people make about you or the tasks they send you to do, those sorts of things. Anyway, so that's sort of my general feelings on Grim Dawn. I guess I have to talk about Darkest Dungeon. Boy, I wonder if I have enough footage to cover this video, because this has gone far too long, but I hope you're enjoying it anyway. Darkest Dungeon, like I said, has these disparate aspects that fundamentally come down to a mechanical money issue, but that belies more fundamental issue with the narrative and the narrative's relationship to the gameplay, the core gameplay loop, which is really that Darkest Dungeon pretends to be a dungeon crawler, and it's not. It is not a dungeon crawler. It pretends to be a dungeon crawler with permanent consequences, or semi-permanent consequences for your choices. And it touts its progression system and pretends to be sort of roguelike in that sense. But ultimately, as I discovered in just pumping money into the economy and realizing that it basically beat the game for me, it's nothing but a management sim. with arbitrary technical stumbling blocks and cruel punishment to hamper your progress and slow the rate of digestion for the game. This is something I've talked a little bit about in a number of other games, but I'm always on the side of giving more options for players to enjoy games in different ways. And yes, I am also a supporter of the sanctity of the artist's vision, even though I also think, the author is dead and all those sorts of things. It's all in conflict in my mind. You'll just have to deal with it. The progression system. The progression system is bad because it wants you to grind over and over and over again, and it wants you to feel the pain and wallow in the discomfort of having your characters suffer and die and become useless. And that's not appealing to me fundamentally. But then when the answer is really the only reason they continue to keep doing that is because you haven't yet collected enough money to buy them out of their suffering, is kind of insulting, at least to me. Because if I had bothered to buy the game and compare a full playthrough to one where I unlock the whole town right at the start, I am willing to bet I would cut at least 3/4 of the average game time out of the game. And that's not just because it's not just because it would be like cheating progression. It literally isn't. It's not cheating progression so much as just like reducing the amount of needless suffering that the game subjects you to in the name of its so-called narrative. Now, I understand that, like, as with horror films, there are people who enjoy watching or experiencing uncomfortable negative emotions, whatever you want, whatever blanket term you want to use. And there is an appeal to that. Even I, I'm somebody who, this is more a personal thing, but like, I'm a big believer in the greatest teacher is failure, where unless something goes wrong, if something goes wrong, people are much more likely to learn a lesson from it and remember that lesson than they will from, slowly progressing in a certain direction and continuing to have success. Boy, this is a weird digression. But this game and a number of others don't really reward you for your suffering. It's just an artificial extension of the mechanics. In much the same way that like a game like Diablo had to extend its content. And this goes back to, the first consoles as well, where, the technical limitations were so severe on those that the repetition had to be very extensive, and the reuse of assets was, had to be really well done to make a 40-hour game out of, a few megs worth of data, basically. But that is no longer that has decreased over time in necessity for a number of reasons, not the least of which is technical limitations, but also the types of budgets that are available and the type of ROI that people get on game development. So having these artificial game lengtheners with every passing year, to my mind, becomes less acceptable. And that is fundamentally what the Darkest Dungeon issue looks like to me. Is it's just stumbling blocks for the sake of stumbling blocks, to make you feel like you got your money's worth because you suffered for a certain number of hours. But as I've said time and time again, I would much rather play a good game for less time than a less good game for more time. It's just my feeling. I recognize that not everyone feels the same way, but I've got too many games to want to, juggle for an age just to get to the end of one of them. Anyway, I don't know if I even made a cohesive thought with this. Holy shit, this is a 45-minute video. This no longer counts as a rant and rave, but I'm still putting the title on it. I guess it is. It is, but it isn't. It's not the same as the others. It's still a rant and rave. I have problems with RPGs and misuse of RPG systems. That's fundamentally what it comes down to. And I would like to see game structures be reflective of what is most compelling and what is, makes for the most cohesive game, not the thing that extends the game or makes it appear more complex than it was before. That's just an unnecessary endeavor that tends to do more harm than good. So anyway, to round back about to my original point, if you're watching this and you've somehow made it to the end, and you have found this at all compelling, one, thank you, but I do hope you'll keep in mind this idea of the difference between complexity and depth. And maybe I'll have ruined all games for you from here on out. I sort of have for myself. So this is my curse that I'm putting out on the world. That recognizing the difference between the two and what parts of the games you play are just there for the sake of adding apparent depth, which is instead just or mostly just complexity. I hope you'll keep that in mind, because I think it's an interesting to think about, and an interesting way to judge games on the whole. Not just RPGs, but all kinds. Anyway, thank you guys for watching this video. I can't believe you made it to the end. I appreciate you making it to the end. And if you're the kind of crazy person who makes it to the end of this video, you might like some of my other videos too. So, yeah. Check them out. Thank you for watching. I've been the Social Solipsist. This has been an extremely long edition of Rants and Raves. And I will see you guys next time.